Hi, I'm Natalie Twedell, and this is my story. I came to know the Lord at 17, and as a brand new believer, was so excited to get involved in ministry, youth ministry. And as I got involved, there was a guy there, and his name was Drew, and he just had such a heart for evangelism and for missions. And so it didn't take long, but soon our hearts were just linked together, and we were crazy and got married very young. And Drew's heart was really for the military and soldiers, and so I quickly became a military wife. Drew wanted to do special forces, but God opened the doors for being a Black Hawk helicopter pilot. And during that time, we got pregnant with our little boy, Caden, and had him in 2005. And about 6 months after Caden was born, Drew deployed. And I can see now the Lord using the deployment as a way of preparing me for what God knew the future was going to hold, of just figuring out being a mom. So Drew deployed for a year and a half and to Iraq as a medevac helicopter pilot. And when he came back, God had really changed his heart to no longer want to be picking up soldiers who had been injured or killed. His heart broke for them, and he wanted to be on the ground doing special forces and not going in afterward. He decided to start training to become a Navy SEAL specifically. Part of the Navy SEAL assessment, he completed the first part. The second part is it's an underwater swim. You push yourself the length of the pool and back without oxygen. I just believe the power of the Holy Spirit, and listening to his promptings, remembering it, that I really felt strongly to talk to Drew, what would happen if you died? And I knew he loved Jesus. I knew he would be with the Lord, but even practically, I thought, I don't even remember, where would you want to be buried? And Drew, at this time, we'd been married almost 6 years. He was only 25 years old. And so I don't think a lot of 25-year-olds are talking about that, but it was very real to me that something could happen to him. May 27th, I was at work, and Drew was with our son, Caden, who was 2.5 at the time. And he went to the gym, to Lakeshore Athletic Club, and was practicing this swim, this 50-meter underwater swim. And I got a call that there had been an accident, and I needed to come to a Vista hospital. And so I drove to Lakeshore Athletic Club, and as I was coming up, I could see the whole place was full of police cars, and I knew something bad had happened. I was 29 weeks pregnant at the time with Ethan, and so I just walked in, waddled myself up to the doors, and said, I need to pick up my son, Caden. The police officer just shook his head, and I just knew that Drew had died. And then my sister came very shortly after that, and I was able to hand Caden off to my brother-in-law, and that God gave me that stability during that time with Caden, of just sitting with him, and I also felt like I didn't want to hear the detective say Drew had died. And so there was something in just saying, I said, please don't say anything else. But as soon as they left the room and I knew what it was, I just collapsed. And but even in that moment, it was almost this decision of, with being given the mind of Christ, was so real to me in that moment, because I could see my mind going this way, and then I could see the eternal, and I was like, oh my goodness, I'm sobbing and breaking down. But then I also was thinking, oh my goodness, Drew's with Jesus right now. There was just this eternal temporary battle from that moment on. And so I ended up going into labor, because it was just really hard on my body, I think, the grief of Drew. And God was so gracious, even stopped that. I mean, I was having a lot of contractions. God was gracious to allow Ethan's birth, he went full term, which I was so thankful for. That would have been so difficult. And weeks later, when I met with the coroner, she said that his body was so strong, so healthy, and his lungs were full of water. And so it's called shallow water blackout, and it's pushing yourself so hard that he passed out. Drew kept a lot of journals, and in that he talked about his journal 2 days before he went home to be with the Lord. He talked about, Lord, renew in me just a spirit that longs for you, that sees the eternal, not just the temporary. And so I could see that, and for me then, it was that same choice of, Lord, I need to grieve, and I was mad and angry, but I could also see that there was hope. The weeks and months following Drew's death, I moved back into our home and had our son Ethan, and the Lord was so gracious to allow Ethan's birth to be one of joy, and there were so many people that surrounded us in prayer, and I had so much support. But suddenly I was wrestling with the Lord of how did I become a mother to 2 little boys, and Drew loved Jesus deeply. And so figuring out God in the midst of that and figuring out who he was, knowing I loved Jesus, and claiming and believing that when he said that he was a father to the fatherless and a husband to the widow, that he physically was in my home and filling those gaps that I couldn't fill, that Drew's death had left. I started getting involved in missions of just at 7 months because I felt like I needed to be reminded, force myself to remember the big picture. And so I had gone overseas with a missions trip, OMF, Overseas Missionary Fellowship, and I just wanted to be a program coordinator. When the boys were asleep at night and I had hours on end, I just started volunteering and in helping send missionaries over. And it almost was forcing myself to not stay just in my grief, even though it continued, but in seeing the big picture. And that a husband was not the answer to my grief or the answer to Drew's death. And I had people say to me, but you'll remarry, oh, Natalie, you'll remarry. And I just thought it was arrogant because even though the intentions were well, because God had never promised me anything. He had promised me himself in Drew's death. So a few years though, after Drew's death, I was going somewhere and my sister said, there's gonna be this guy there, and I go to church with him, but just keep an eye out for him. And I was like, oh, Christina. And so I saw him and thought, oh, he's cute, but I just wasn't even, actually I shouldn't say I wasn't thinking anything. I thought, oh, he's really cute. And so anyway, we went to coffee, and even in that, when you date, you get to know somebody by sharing your story. God was so good. Matt asked about Drew. I specifically remember. And it wasn't this, why did he ask that? It was the opposite. It was like the Lord saying, Matt was a confident enough man that he could handle that, which is messy, but he could, and he wanted to know. And so the Lord was really good in that. And then we started dating, and he met the boys, and there was just this fitting together. So we, pretty early on, about 6 weeks, or maybe for me it was 6 weeks, I just knew I loved him. And actually he did tell me. He told me about 7 weeks along that he loved me. And so we just knew that this was leading toward marriage. And when he proposed, he asked Caden what he would think. And the sweetest story too is Matt has given the boys freedom to talk about Drew. So he allows that for the boys too, of processing things, of wanting to know more about Drew, and he's never made us feel guilty. So he's wonderful. He's a good man to step in. And one other thing that was so gracious of the Lord is Drew had run the Colfax Marathon the week before he died. And I remember being at the end, and I hated running at the time, and I watched him finish, and we had done another race together, and he had told me, he said, when I come to the end of every race, because he loved running, he said, I always think of the verse in Hebrews 12 that talks about running the race with perseverance and throwing off everything that hinders And he said, and being surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, those who have gone on before. And he said when he comes into a race, it's like that reminder of those cheering for you, they are done with the race, but you are still running, and to run with perseverance. And so years later, I was like, I'm gonna do that Colfax marathon. And it was just God's redemption, because I had Matt at the finish line and my boys. And 5 years prior, I had been at the finish line with my pregnant belly and Caden cheering Drew on, not knowing his race was gonna be finished in about a week, but that the Lord did still have a race for me and for the boys, and he hadn't taken his hand off of us.